The first time I knew the HOA was up to something shady was when I came home to find a bright orange sticker slapped on my boathouse. Property of Lakeshore Community HOA trespassing will be prosecuted. I stood there, keys still in hand. My name is Everett Granger. I bought this lakefront home outright 6 years ago. Paid off, no mortgage, no liens. It's in unincorporated county land surrounded by woods and water. No gates, no HOA. Or so I thought. That's when she showed up, Florinda Reynolds. Mid-50s, pinched face, sunglasses big enough to block out the sun and any trace of decency. She marched up with a clipboard like she was patrolling a military base. "You're trespassing," she said, pointing at my feet like I'd stepped on sacred ground. I raised an eyebrow. "Trespassing." "I live here." She didn't blink. "This property is now under Lakeshore Community HOA jurisdiction. We voted to annex the lakefront perimeter for aesthetic unity. You'll need to submit an application for occupancy and pay back dues." I actually laughed. "You think you can just annex my house?" She clicked her pen. "The board passed the vote. It's binding. You should have attended the meeting." "I'm not in your HOA," I said. "Never was. This house predates all of this." She handed me a packet, 30 pages of nonsense with fabricated maps, fake plats, and a dues invoice for over $9,000. That night I didn't sleep. I spent hours digging through my deed, survey records, and tax receipts. All of it clearly showed I owned the land free and clear, no HOA involvement. But these clowns had filed a fraudulent plat map with the county recorder's office, trying to redraw borders to include my property. I drove straight to the county office the next morning and spoke with a clerk named Ron. He looked over the documents, then leaned in and said, "They filed a boundary adjustment request last month. It's under review, but it's fishy. You might want to lawyer up." So I did. I hired my old friend Felix, a real estate attorney who owed me a favor. We filed a cease and desist against the HOA and submitted counter documents proving the fraud. 2 days later, Florinda showed up again, this time with 2 HOA board members in tow, both of them with matching polos and smug attitudes. "You're in violation of community standards for unapproved dock design," she said, pointing at my 30-year-old dock like it had personally insulted her. Felix stepped out from my porch. "Unless you want a fraud charge added to your growing list of problems, I suggest you stop harassing my client." Florinda's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over." She was right. It wasn't, but not in the way she hoped. What they didn't know was that Felix and I had already pulled every HOA filing they'd made for the past 5 years. And what we found? Let's just say this wasn't their first time trying to absorb private property. They'd done it to a retired couple up the road, pressured them until they sold their place for pennies. Same orange sticker tactic. I wasn't about to be next. I installed 4 cameras, 2 facing the dock, 1 on the driveway, and 1 hidden near the property line. I posted a bright yellow sign on the boathouse. "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." The next week, Florinda and her goons came back again, this time with bolt cutters. They didn't know I was watching from the upstairs window with Felix, coffee in hand, and a sheriff's deputy on speakerphone. The deputy's cruiser pulled up just as the bolt cutters clanged against the steel lock on my boathouse gate. Florinda froze mid-swing, her 2 board members, one tall and jittery, the other built like a retired linebacker, stiffening like they'd just been caught robbing a bank. Deputy Rivas stepped out, hand resting on his belt, not on his firearm, but close enough to make a point. He glanced at the bolt cutters, then at the sign posted above them. He didn't say anything at first, just raised an eyebrow. "You want to explain what you're doing?" he asked finally, voice calm but edged. Florinda straightened up, brushing imaginary dust off her blouse. "This structure is under HOA jurisdiction and in violation of multiple community standards. We were executing a compliance order." Deputy Rivas didn't budge. "Got paperwork from a judge," she hesitated. "The board approved the enforcement. The bylaws don't care," he cut in. "Private property. County records show this parcel isn't within HOA boundaries. That makes this trespassing and attempted destruction of private property. The linebacker type opened his mouth. Rivas held up a hand. Save it. All three of you step back and stay put. They didn't argue. Rivas called for backup to document the scene, and within 20 minutes, a second unit arrived. They photographed the bolt cutters, took statements, and handed Florinda a citation for trespassing along with a verbal warning that any further enforcement visits would escalate to criminal charges. Felix, calm as ever, leaned against the rail of my porch and watched them leave like it was just another Tuesday. "We're going to need to make this public," he said. "Quiet legal work's not going to cut it alone." He was right, of course. These folks relied on intimidation and silence. Time to flip the script. The next morning, I filed an official complaint with the county zoning board not just about the fraudulent plat maps, but also about the HOA's attempt to enforce jurisdiction over non-member properties. Felix drafted a parallel complaint for the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, citing unauthorized business practices and attempted property seizure. Then we went bigger. I called a local reporter I knew from my construction company days, a guy named Danny Keller, who'd covered everything from zoning scandals to corrupt building inspectors. I gave him everything: the fake maps, the orange sticker, the bolt cutter incident, even the audio from my surveillance system. He showed up later that week with a camera crew and zero subtlety. Florinda didn't answer her door when Danny knocked, but that didn't stop him from running the story. HOA war, residents accuse board of land grabs, fraudulent maps, and harassment. It aired that Friday night. By Saturday morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. One of the calls was from a man named Arthur Prout, a retired geologist who lived 2 streets over. He'd been through something similar, pressured to sell his lake access strip after the board claimed it was common shoreline. He didn't have the resources to fight them, so he caved, but he still had records. I met him on his back porch. He handed me a folder thick with documents, letters from the HOA, altered property diagrams, and one internal memo he'd somehow gotten hold of, an email from Florinda to the board titled Strategic Consolidation Targets. It listed 7 properties. Mine was number 5. Arthur's had been number 2. Felix's eyes lit up when he saw it. "This is conspiracy-level material. If we can show they coordinated this with intent to defraud property owners, they're toast," I finished. He nodded. "Get ready. We're filing suit next week." But before we could, the HOA tried one more stunt. I came home 3 days later to find a construction crew unloading materials at the end of my driveway. A man in a reflective vest waved a clipboard at me. "HOA's putting in a perimeter walkway," he said. "We've got permits." I didn't even answer. I walked straight into the house, pulled up the county permit database, and found no such filing. Not even a pending request. Felix faxed an emergency injunction request to the local courthouse within the hour. The judge granted it overnight. The crew left the next morning, muttering about crazy paperwork. Florinda didn't show her face again for days. When she finally did, it was in a courtroom. We filed a civil suit for attempted property seizure, fraudulent filings, harassment, and trespassing. Felix brought everything: the fake plat maps, the surveillance footage, Arthur's documents, and a signed affidavit from Ron at the county office confirming that the HOA had submitted altered boundary lines without notifying affected property owners, a clear violation of state law. Florinda's attorney tried to argue that the board had acted in good faith. The judge didn't buy it. "Good faith doesn't involve bolt cutters," he said dryly. The court ordered a full audit of the HOA's filings and financials. That's when the real rot came out. Turns out, the board had used member dues to pay for the mapping work, legal threats, and even private surveillance of targeted properties, none of which had been disclosed to members in their quarterly financial reports. Worse, they'd spent over 20 grand hiring a consulting firm to evaluate expansion opportunities, which was just a fancy way of saying, figure out how to steal more land. The county district attorney got involved after that. Fraud charges were filed against two board members, the linebacker and the tall guy. Florinda was hit with civil penalties and removed from her position by court order. She tried to appeal, but the damage was done. The judge ruled in our favor across the board. The HOA was ordered to pay restitution, cover all legal expenses, and issue a formal retraction of their claim to my property published in the local paper and mailed to every homeowner in the neighborhood. But we weren't done. Felix and I, along with Arthur and 3 other residents who came forward, petitioned the state to revoke the HOA's charter. With the fraud case and financial mismanagement on record, the state agreed. Lakeshore Community HOA was dissolved 6 weeks later. In its place, we formed a voluntary neighborhood association, strictly advisory, no enforcement powers, no dues unless voluntarily contributed. We held our first meeting on my deck, overlooking the lake they once tried to steal. I grilled burgers. Arthur brought beer. Felix gave a brief rundown of how we'd keep checks in place to avoid any repeat of the tyranny we'd just dismantled. Someone asked what happened to Florinda. Last I heard, she moved 2 counties over, bought a townhouse in a gated community with a strict HOA. Rumor was she tried to run for their board. They rejected her unanimously. 2 months after the court dissolved the HOA, summer settled in with thick heat and longer days. On paper, the fight was over. But underneath, something still didn't sit right. The community was quieter, sure. But too quiet, like the calm after a storm that hadn't quite passed. Felix had warned me to keep a close eye on lingering board members. Just because the HOA was dead didn't mean its influence vanished overnight. Then came the letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, no return address, tucked between a utility bill and a fishing magazine. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of a property lien notice filed under my name. Handwritten across the bottom was a message: "You took something from us. Now we take it back." Felix read it while pacing my deck. "They're trying to go around the ruling. This lien is through a shell LLC. I looked at the filing number. Can they even do that? They can try. But if we dig deep enough, we'll find who's behind it. The shell company, Said Arview Holdings, had been registered just a week earlier. Felix pulled in a forensic accountant he'd worked with on a corporate embezzlement case. Within 4 days, we had names. The LLC was owned by a man named Ronan Vick. He wasn't on the HOA board, but he had close ties to the former treasurer. Turned out they were brothers-in-law. Ronan had purchased small parcels of land scattered around the lake months before the court case. Nothing large enough to matter on its own, but when taken together, they formed a chain of shoreline easements. By filing a lien through Setterview, he was trying to claim I owed fees for shared access infrastructure that didn't exist. I took the file to the county recorder's office. The clerk on duty, a woman named Lynette, flipped through the documents and frowned. "This isn't just shady," she said. "This is criminal if they are using false access claims to file liens." She flagged the filing as potentially fraudulent, then referred the matter to the district attorney's office. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 nights later, someone cut the power line running to my dock. They didn't just pull a breaker, they severed the line clean, buried the end under gravel, and left no trace unless you knew where to look. I found it the next morning when my motion lights failed to come on. I called the utility company, who confirmed the line had been tampered with. They filed a report and advised me to contact law enforcement. I already had. Deputy Rivas came out again. He crouched by the gravel and ran his hand over the disturbed earth. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," he muttered. "This isn't vandalism. This is targeted." He took photos, logged an incident report, and promised to escalate it to the county investigator. But I could see it in his eyes this was getting out of hand. Felix wasn't surprised when I told him. "They're testing limits," he said. "They lost the HOA, they lost the lawsuit, but they haven't lost their obsession with control. This isn't about money anymore, it's personal." We started documenting everything: camera footage, timestamps, even suspicious vehicles. I upgraded to a full surveillance system with thermal imaging and remote access. No one was sneaking up on me again. Then the break-in happened. I was out picking up lumber for a client project when my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected workshop. I pulled up the feed and froze. Two men, faces covered, were inside my detached workshop. One held a crowbar, the other rifled through drawers. I called 911, gave my address, then called Felix. By the time I got home, deputies had already cordoned off the area. The men were gone, but not empty-handed. They'd taken my hard drive backups, everything we'd stored related to the HOA's fraudulent filings, including scanned copies of the original maps and financials. What they didn't know was that I kept a mirrored server in my attic completely offline. The footage, the documents, the signed affidavits, they still existed. But now it wasn't just a matter of property fraud. It was criminal conspiracy, breaking and entering, and obstruction of justice. The DA's office launched a formal investigation the next morning. Their lead investigator, Carla DeWitt, met me at my place. They were careful, she said, examining the workshop door. No prints, no cameras tampered with, but they missed one thing. She held up a small evidence bag with a torn piece of fabric caught on a nail by the window they used to get in. Forensics traced it back to a utility jacket issued to contractors working with a private shoreline development group, one owned by, of course, Centerview Holdings. That was the final crack. Once Carla subpoenaed Centerview's internal communications, everything unraveled. Emails between Ronan and Florinda showed they'd coordinated the Leon scheme before the HOA was dissolved. The break-in, traced to two subcontractors paid under the table, both with connections to former HOA board members, the most damning piece. A ledger showing payments from the HOA's old discretionary fund transferred right before the court froze their accounts to an unregistered address in another county. That address belonged to a storage unit rented by the former HOA treasurer. Inside, investigators found boxes of documents detailing 3 years of off-the-books transactions, including payments to pressure homeowners into selling and falsified property assessments. The DA charged Ronan, Florinda, and 2 others with felony fraud, conspiracy to commit property theft, and tampering with legal evidence. Both subcontractors were also arrested for the break-in. The trial was swift. Carla presented the entire network of deceit, how they formed shell companies to keep power after the HOA was stripped away, how they tried to sabotage legal evidence, and how they coordinated direct attacks on my property. The jury didn't deliberate long, guilty on all counts. The judge issued the maximum sentence allowed for each charge. Ronan got 15 years, Florinda 10. The rest received lesser sentences, but none walked free. After the verdict, Carla approached me outside the courthouse. "You were the first one who didn't fold," she said. "Most people would have sold or moved. You didn't," I nodded. "They thought they could take what they wanted. This time they picked the wrong house." With the last of the legal mess behind us, the neighborhood came alive again, not with fear, but with purpose. The voluntary association we'd built had grown. Folks who once kept their heads down now spoke up, attended meetings, and reminded each other what we'd been through. We installed a new community board, elected by majority vote with strict oversight measures, no secret meetings, no backdoor deals. Every financial transaction logged and available for public review. At the first town gathering after the trial, Arthur raised a toast from a folding chair in my backyard. "To Everett," he said, holding up a plastic cup, "for refusing to let the weeds grow over the truth." I didn't say much. Just raised my own cup and nodded. We'd faced down corruption, intimidation, and outright criminal acts and won. Not because we had power, but because we had proof, persistence, and each other. The lake shimmered behind us, untouched and quiet. A place finally returned to what it was always meant to be, home. Felix called me just after sunrise, his voice lacking its usual calm. "There's a sealed motion scheduled for hearing this week." filed by a private counsel representing a group called the Lakeshore Restoration Coalition. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. Never heard of them. What's the motion about? They're petitioning to classify the entire lakefront as a conservation easement. If it passes, private ownership rights could be overridden under state environmental protection statutes. I sat up. That would include my property, not just yours, everyone who lives within sight of the water. I didn't need to ask who was behind it. Felix already had a theory. The names on the filing trace back to a law firm that once handled Cedarview's zoning appeals. They're trying to rebrand the takeover under a different banner. I didn't wait. I drove straight to the county courthouse and requested a public viewing of the motion. It took some maneuvering, but a clerk I hadn't met before eventually handed over a copy. The language was vague, deliberately so. This wasn't environmentalism. It was camouflage. Felix met me that afternoon at the community center, where we'd started holding open forums since the HOA was dismantled. The place was full dozens of neighbors, many of whom had stayed silent during the early days of the fight. I walked in with the motion copy in one hand and the attendance list from the conservation group's last meeting in the other. "These people," I said, holding the papers up, "aren't protecting the lake. They're trying to take it again. Only this time they're calling it a public trust." A woman named Celeste, who owned a small pottery shop near the West Inlet, stood from the back. "They came by my place last week," she said. "Said if I didn't support the easement, I'd be listed as a non-cooperative stakeholder." Whatever that means. It meant they were reviving the same pressure tactics, just dressed up in legalese. We needed to stop the vote before it reached the county board. Felix drafted a counter-motion that same evening, citing the previous fraud case and the criminal convictions of everyone connected to the current petitioners. He attached a detailed timeline of events, including the break-in, the Leon scheme, and the recent sabotage of the power line now confirmed by forensic review. But it wasn't enough to just fight back. We needed the public on our side, so we organized an open day at the lake. We called it Our Shore, Our Story. Families brought food, kids swam off the docks, and Arthur brought a projector screen to play a short film we'd thrown together. It detailed the entire ordeal: interviews, footage, documents. Everything. By the time the credits rolled, you could feel the shift in the air. People weren't just angry. They were ready. The next morning, over 80 residents signed a petition formally opposing the conservation easement. Felix filed it with the county clerk along with our counter-motion. We also sent a formal ethics complaint to the State Environmental Board, flagging the coalition's ties to individuals with active criminal records and previous land fraud attempts. The hearing was held in a packed courthouse. The judge presiding was known for her no-nonsense approach and a background in land use law. The coalition's attorney, a silver-haired man with a voice like syrup, tried to paint their effort as a grassroots ecological initiative. He kept his wording careful, avoiding any mention of Cedarview, the HOA, or the prior convictions. But the judge wasn't buying it. "Your client list includes individuals convicted of property fraud less than 8 months ago," she said. "And yet you expect this court to believe their sudden interest in environmental protection is untainted by past motives." He tried to pivot. She raised a finger. "No." "You'll answer the question directly," he hesitated. Then answered, "Some of our supporters may have had past business dealings that are unrelated." She leaned forward. "Unrelated. Or undeclared." Then Felix stepped up, presenting our documentation, including a notarized statement from one of the original board members who turned over evidence during the criminal investigation. It confirmed that the conservation petition had been drafted as a fallback plan in case the HOA dissolution and lawsuit failed. The judge requested a recess for review. 45 minutes later, she returned with her ruling. The court finds the petition for conservation easement to be submitted in bad faith, with clear intent to override previous judicial determinations. The motion is denied. Furthermore, this court refers the petitioning group to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into potential violations of land use ethics statutes. That was it. The last thread of the old regime finally cut. Outside the courthouse, people gathered on the steps. Some clapped. Others just stood in quiet relief. Felix looked over at me. "You realize," he said, "they tried 3 separate legal strategies to take your land." 3 too many, I said. Over the next few weeks, the so-called Lakeshore Restoration Coalition dissolved. The state's attorney general opened an inquiry, and several of its members faced civil penalties for filing misleading legal documents under oath. No one tried anything after that. We finalized the neighborhood's new charter, which strictly limited any future association powers to advisory roles only. Any proposed changes had to be voted on by at least 2/3 of all households, with mandatory third-party legal review. Felix stepped away from his role soon after, saying with a grin that he preferred fighting battles, not babysitting committees. Arthur took over as chair of the Community Advisory Board. His first act was to install a permanent notice board beside the lake trail, engraved with the words, "Property belongs to the people who live here." Celeste organized a small art fair by the boathouse later that fall. She gifted me a ceramic plaque shaped like the shoreline, with the words "Never bought, never broken" etched along the bottom. I hung it just inside the workshop, above the old server tower that never got touched. The lake settled into its rhythm again, birds nesting near the dock, kids skipping rocks in the evening, the air clean and still. We didn't win because we had better lawyers or more money. We won because we didn't let them wear us down. Every time they shifted tactics, we shifted faster. Every time they tried the shadows, we brought the fight into the light. And when people ask me now what it took to defeat a corrupt HOA and the schemes that followed, I tell them the truth. It took neighbors who refused to be silent, a lawyer who wouldn't back down, a judge who saw through the lies, and a lake that reminded us what it meant to stand our ground.